Hello, a very warm welcome from me as well. My name is Beatriz Michaelis and I'm gonna be chairing this post-lunch session. Post-lunch is always a difficult time, but I'm not afraid because we have two very exciting keynote speakers, and I'm very much looking forward to their talks. Before we start, I was asked to ask you whether you will need translation either into German or into Spanish. Both talks will be in English, so is there somebody who would like to have translation? That does not seem to be the case. Okay. Good. So then let's start. The panel is called Migration Regimes and Gender, and we'll have the two presentations after one another, and then we'll have a joint discussion. So I will introduce our two speakers to you right now, and then we'll listen to their respective talks. We'll start with the talk by Gülay Toksöz, and I'm very excited that she's here. She comes to us from Ankara University and from the Department of Political Science, Department of Labor, Economics and Industrial Relations. She actually received her PhD from the Free University in Berlin, working on a topic that dealt with migrant female workers and especially their role in trade union activities. And then she moved on to Ankara, where she has been teaching since 1992. There are quite a number of publications by her. I won't mention all of them. There are, for instance, books called Current Discussions on Unemployment in Developed Countries, which appeared in Turkish in 1999, and International Labor Migration, again in Turkish, from 2006. But she's also made other books, of course, and there's also her latest one dealing with female labor in development. And, of course, she has also co-edited a number of books, again dealing with, for instance, irregular migration, informal labor as a challenge for Europe, and also women's labor in Turkey from past to present, which appeared in 2012, the second book that she has co-edited with colleagues. Today, Gülay Toksöz, as you can see already, will talk about, of course, pertaining to the panel here about women's labor and how does patriarchy and capitalism articulate in different parts of the developing world. And this will be the first presentation that we'll hear. And afterwards we'll have the second presentation from our second guest, Beatriz Padilla. And she comes to us from the University of Minho, where she has been teaching since 2013. Beatriz Padilla received her PhD from the University of Illinois in sociology, and she's working in a variety of fields, and her interests include immigration, Latin America, and Latino, then diversity, health, public policy, and that's, I think, something we will hear more about today. Of course, she has also quite a number of publications. Again, I will only mention a few. There have been a number of articles published this year, including Building Identities of Youth of Immigrant Origin in Europe, results from a European project, and Migration and Change, Trajectories, Identities and Transformation, and also Transnational Citizenship, Latin Americans in Portugal. And we will hear something about material matters in times of crisis, gender and migration matters in austerity in her talk. And without further ado, I would like to invite Gülay Toksöz to the stage. Thank you.
Well, greetings from Ankara to everybody here. And I would like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to Giessen and giving the opportunity to speak to you. I just want to make a correction. As I was invited, my first intention was to speak on the articulation of capitalism and patriarchy with respect to the position of women's labor in different parts of the world. But then I saw that in the program, my name is under migration regime, so I changed the topic. because I have two areas of interest since my PhD studies, I would say. One is the migrant labor in general, but migrant women labor in special, and the other one is the gendered structure of labor markets. So I am working on both issues together simultaneously, but today what I am going to present is actually on the informal economy and migrants' contribution to welfare. So my aim is actually to show how the welfare of developed nations is based on migrants' labor, and this is an undervalued and underestimated labor. And I will be going to speak with a gendered perspective, just to highlight the role of migrant women in this process. And as we all know, the neoliberal policies, the change of mode of production, and transfer of labor-intensive manufacturing branches from developed to the developing world have impact on the labor markets on both sides, as well as impact on the migrant labor. Therefore, in this presentation, first I want to draw a general framework on the international division of labor within the context of globalization and its impact on labor markets, especially in the direction of informalization. And then I want to tackle the issue of migrant workers' position in the labor markets with respect to ethnic business as examples of informal sector enterprises. And then I will discuss on the role of female labor, especially in domestic and care work. And finally, I'm going to address the issue of migrant labor in Turkey. The international division of labor, actually, which took place after the 70s, after the economic crisis, as a solution to the economic crisis, meant the transfer of labor-intensive manufacturing industries to the developing countries, especially the environmentally harmful branches. And within the context of an export-oriented industrialization, these developing countries have these factories in their own sectors in which large manufacturers govern the production process. In the first case, which is mostly transferred to the developing countries, we see that informal activities flourished very quickly as the big firms preferred to outsource the labor-intensive parts of manufacturing to smaller firms, factories, sweatshops, and even till down to the home-based work. And in this division of labor, the management of the multinational corporations, which stayed in the countries of the developed world, just confined their work to design and marketing, and the others, the total production took place in the developing countries. And they were either in medium-sized or small-sized enterprises. And it was actually a very conscious politic to be able to escape from the regulations of the labor market, because for the smaller firms it is much easier to stay outside of these regulations compared to the big companies. So export-oriented industrialization meant for these countries the widespread practice of informalization in the labor markets. And it meant that a big number or big share of the labor force in these countries should work without taking into consideration the regulations of the labor market, namely without social protection, without social security in concrete sense, and without obeying the rules of the labor laws. And we can conclude that the flexibility in developing countries take the form of informalization, and it exhibits different characteristics in developing world compared to the developed world, where flexibility usually took the form of flexible specialization. When I speak from informal sector enterprises and informal employment, I am pointing to two different things. According to ILO, includes all types of people working in the formal sector, informal sector, or households working outside regulations protecting the labor force. So they don't have usually social security, not usually, but always, they don't have the social security, employment benefits, and other type of protective regulations. So I just want to refer to an explanation from Castas and Portes, who wrote one of the basic texts on informal economy. And they defined informal economy, where the informal sector enterprises and informal employment is coexisting, as a process of income generation characterized by one central feature. It is unregulated by the institutions of the society in a legal and social environment in which similar activities are regulated. In this definition, actually, they are pointing out to a process of informalization from above. They are pointing out to the acts of firms, big firms, who are not in a position to escape from the rules and regulations, to delegate the production activities, smaller firms which are in a position to escape these rules. So it is the informalization from above. And from various literature on informal economy and informal sector enterprises, this is the structuralist approach. But we know there are also other approaches, like the neoliberal approach, which blames the strict tax regulations or labor protection regulations, forcing the enterprises to escape them. Or there is a third approach, which emphasizes the deficiencies of very small enterprises, not in a position to comply with the rules and regulations in the labor market. So it is important, this approach, which is usually used in Latin American countries to understand the position of small enterprises, to understand the ethnic business in developed countries formed by migrant people. So we can also say that the informal economy or informal economic activities, which is a very dominant character of the least developed countries, developing countries, but at the same time of the developed countries, especially in the global cities. Especially we know from the work of Sasson, in which she tackles the global cities in her various work, that these cities are actually territories of conflict between very big firms, multinational firms, mostly operating in the areas of service and finance, and employing high-level professionals, at the same time creating a necessity for other service sector to serve these type of professionals in their daily lives. So they just complete each other in these global cities. Very formalized big firms, and on the other side, small informalized firms serving to this group of employees. So she says that this is a result of global inequality, shows itself in the informalization of production and distribution activities, and for the low profit sector firms, small firms, informalization is the only possibility of survival. In the informal economy, we see the poorly educated workers, low-income earners, small business people, women and immigrants, all the disadvantaged groups of the labor markets. And this is considered to be the informalization from below, namely to achieve some level of economic security in a highly precarious environment as defined by Leonard. Within this context, now we can come to the situation of the migrant workers. As we all know, migrant workers were recruited, especially in Western Europe, starting in the 50s and continuing till the mid-70s, to work in the manufacturing industries and in the mining sector. And with the new international division of labor, as these manufacturing activities were mostly transferred to other peripheral countries, the migrants either lost their jobs and become unemployed, or they started to be the workers of some other economic activity branches. When I speak of this transfer, you should keep in mind that there are always some small-sized enterprises which are not in a position to transfer their activities, so they continue to produce in the developed countries, and they need, of course, cheap labor force in order to exist, and then they refer to the migrant workforce. However, when we look at the new workers of this type of enterprises, not only in manufacturing but mostly in services sector, small-sized enterprises of services sector, in tourism sector, in agriculture and in construction, we see that the natives actually avoid these type of jobs. But not only the natives, the regular migrants who usually have gained the status of citizenship, they also try to avoid these type of jobs as long as they are eligible for welfare benefits. So new labor force is necessary, and for this new labor force, new migrants come from other countries. So we see that there are differences now on the basis of ethnicity who are coming to the developed countries, and at the same time, besides ethnicity, we see that these people, the basic characteristic of these people are being irregular. And then there is a new labor market segmentation in these countries with the classical first sector and the second sector, again reformulated as the second sector, small enterprises mostly to be found in the agriculture, construction and tourism. Although there is a need for new migrants for this type of jobs in small enterprises, we see that the governments are not in a position to accept this reality, and they usually just try to encourage the labor mobility or migration of skilled workers and try to prevent the migration of unskilled workers. So, with this conscious or unconscious conception of the labor market reality, trying to prevent the incoming of de-skilled migrants or migrants for jobs, de-skilled jobs, they opened the ways for irregular migration. So we can say that the irregular migration and migrants' vulnerable positions is actually a result of governments, developed countries' governments, wrong decisions about the needs of the labor market. And I have to add that when I am focusing on the developed world, at the same time in developing countries, this type of population flows, labor flows also take place. Usually the migrants from the least developed parts of the world who are aiming to go to West or the advanced capitalist countries, when they are prevented by very strict labor border controls, are no more able to proceed So they usually stay in the countries of transit and become new labor force, migrant labor force of these countries. So this migration movement is not anymore between South and North, it is between South and South, between countries of different levels of development. But what is common to both of them is the vulnerability of the irregular migrants. As they are undocumented persons, they are forced to work under very difficult conditions, very long hours, and usually with lower wages, which would not be accepted by the people, the native or the regular migrants in the country. And we see that this informal forms of employment is actually not restricted only with irregular migrants. At the same time, regular migrants are also part of this economic unregulated activities. One reason is that the transition between regular and irregular positions, especially in Southern European countries where regularization attempts have been taken, usually the migrants who gained the position of being regular due to the temporary nature of their jobs and permits of work and residence, then fall again to a position of irregularity. But I just want to give some statistical data from a recent study, findings of the European Social Survey, showing that how prevalent is informal work among regular migrants. When they call informal employment, they look at the employment without contracts and very small-sized enterprises, unpaid family work, and similar things. And according to that, in general, in the EU, 16% is the rate of informality among all employment. There are, of course, differences between countries of the European Union, and it is much more concrete in case of South Mediterranean countries, European countries. It is around 16% among the natives, but it is around 24 to 37% in all other groups. All other groups are the regular migrants of first generation, second generation, ethnic or linguistic minorities. And which sectors are most affected from informality? We see the hotels and restaurants, personal and household services, construction and agriculture, and trade, which are actually the branches where the migrants are to be employed most. And I can say that, it is the conclusion of this research that exclusion and discrimination play an important role in pushing employees into informality. And the only exception is the self-employed migrants, which prefer to do their own work to escape from this type of pressures. So we can assert that the informal economy and the informal sector enterprises in it mostly depend on migrant workers. And it is much different from the situation in the 70s, 60s and 70s when migrants were recruited to work in the factories where they can organize, be trade union members, and have collective bargaining rights. So they are, in that sense, more in a position of struggle to gain their rights. And now the new migrants are no more objectively in a position to organize and defend their rights. Now I can come to the ethnic business as an important form of informal and sector enterprises. As I mentioned earlier, not all of the manufacturing enterprises have been transferred to developing world. There were always some parts of economic activity which stayed in the country, homeland country, to satisfy local demand. And of course they were confronted with a very limited profit margin because of the cheap exports now coming from the developing world. So in order to survive, these type of firms used ethnic business as for their subcontracting, and they let them produce for themselves. And we see that lots of sweatshops emerged in different parts of Europe in the 80s and 90s, and in a work of his Shirab, in a work published in 2007, he looked at the subcontracting practices in different countries of Europe, and especially for UK. He termed or used the definition of bloody subcontracting, just pointing out to the very difficult working conditions, and mostly women from minorities or the migrant families working in these garment workshops. They were very considered to be very cheap labor. So at the intersection of race and gender, we see that women were functionalized, migrant women. But afterwards, at the end of 90s, it was no more possible for these garment industry workshops to exist with increasing competition, let's say from the Southeast Asian countries. So they usually closed and just limited their activity with sales of imported goods. A very recent study on the textile workshops, the history of the textile workshops in London as ethnic business from Turkish people, and the role of migrant women in these workshops, show us that after the closure of these garment workshops, for the women it was no more possible to find jobs, similar jobs. And in spite of its being a bloody subcontracting, the women considered it to be a high earning potential for which they could earn money for their labor. Afterwards, they started to work in the ethnic catering sector, either as very low paid workers or as family members. So their labor is seen as the extension of their domestic duties at home. It was not valued, it was not esteemed, so they could get either no payment for their activity or very limited activity. So they become even a cheaper labor force. But I should emphasize the fact that these type of small ethnic business, the kebab shops, we can say them the döner shops in Germany, they are based mainly on the family labor, and it is the owner, they are also working for very long hours, and so it is in a way self-exploitation in order to exist in this very highly competitive markets. There are some more other research on the garment industry belonging to Indian people, migrants living in UK, and they also show the same trend for them, that they at the end close their shops and usually just have further the catering shops, and they also depend on their undocumented co-ethnics to exist. So we see that this extreme labor intensiveness and long working hours and low payment is not only for the profit maximizing purposes of the enterprise owners, which are usually also depending on their own work, but at the same time it offers for the local markets valuable and affordable goods and services for the consumers. So we can say that this ethnic business and migrant labor in it contribute to the wealth of the people in the developed countries. Now I can come to the situation of migrant women in domestic and care work. So Again, in one of her work from Sassen in 2000, Counter Geographies of Globalization and the Feminization of Survival, she attracts our attention to the impoverishing impact of structural adjustment policies in the developing countries, which have huge debts, foreign debts, and unemployment. So the governments of these countries decided to export workforce in order to get the remittances to pay their debts. So especially they encourage the migrant women's migration to work in countries as domestic workers or nurses or in some other work branches. So Sassen speaks of the alternative global circuits of development and the feminization of survival. The remittance issue is now one of the most important issue on the agenda of international organizations who are related with migration, and especially World Bank estimates and values it very highly, saying that it is a big contribution for the economies of this type of countries. And just to mention a number, in a survey from World Bank from 2013, they estimated the amount of remittances sent to developing countries as $400 billion US. And 15 years ago, it was only 70 billion. You can see how rapidly it increases. So, of course, it is very important for these countries, for the governments, in order to finance their imports and to continue with their economic activities. But at the same time, they are very important for the household consumptions of the migrants' families. A recent literature review from Benaria, Diarra, and Kaber shows that, according to their literature review, women's remitting behavior is much more different than men's. Women send much more higher shares of their incomes to their families, and this money is spent for the health and the education and for the nutrition of the children. In that sense, it can also be considered as a promotion of human development in these countries. So we can say that migrant women contribute to the wealth of their own countries as well. But on the other side, they also contribute to the wealth of the developed countries in different ways, but we are going to see now. There is an increasing demand for female migrant workforce, especially in the care sector and the health sector, but also in other sectors like entertainment and sex, and perhaps some more. We see that there are various factors which are influencing this increasing demand. There is a huge literature, of course, on care work, on migrant women's role in care work. Just to mention some, I wrote in the slide, you can see them. But we see that one first important factor is the demographic situation, the change in the demographic structure, the aging of these societies, due to declining fertility rates and increasing life expectancy. And for old and sick and disabled people, the need for care increases due to this structural changes. But at the same time, another factor is the increasing labor force participation, which can be traced back to the 80s as a response to the economic crisis of the 70s. And as we all know, it is the start point of the feminization of the labor force. It took different forms in different parts of the world, but we know that in developed countries, there was a very conscious decision after the stoppage of the recruitment of migrant workers to make more use of the female labor, native female labor in the country. Of course, combined with women's movement also for women's equal rights in the labor market for participation, employment, and working conditions. So it also created a pressure on the care needs of the women participating in the labor markets. So as the third, we can speak of the changes in the welfare regimes and states' withdrawal from services. Well, there are different types of welfare regimes. Not all of them were acting responsible with respect to care needs. But although the demands increased for more states' interference in this area, we see that actually the reaction is more withdrawal and letting the market forces to be effective in this area. So the increasing care deficit created the demand for migrant women to take over this type of work. Domestic work in general, independent from migrants, is an unregulated area of work. Even when the native workers do this type of work, it is unregulated. Usually it is left outside of labor laws, left outside of unionization laws, and it is seen as an extension of women's duties, the invisible and unvalued work at home, and as it is done in the market for money, it is paid much more lower compared to other types of jobs. So we can, in this point, look at the situation in the European Union countries a little bit closer. And we can say that there are three actors in the field: the state, the family, and the market, to respond to the care deficit. And at the same time, the organization of the care services is much related with the welfare regime, the welfare state regime, and it is also related with the national employment models, which is actually a consequence of the welfare state regime. We all know, I guess, this typical division from Esping Andersen, the three classification of welfare states. The social democratic welfare state regime, which aims actually full employment and gender equality in labor markets, takes care as a public responsibility. And the citizens of these regimes, countries, have care as a right, basic right. It is recognized as a right. So the organization of the care services is usually by the public institutions, and the workforce for it is trained as professionals, and the workforce have clearly defined jobs with protective schemes. But in the opposite, in the liberal welfare state regime, men and women are also considered to be equal without taking care of the responsibilities of women at home, the care and household responsibilities. So they are expected to participate in the labor markets and to solve their problems of care on their own with procurement of services from the labor markets. So in this type of liberal welfare state regimes, which UK can be shown as an example, there are private sector firms offering this type of services, but they are mostly confronted with labor shortage due to low wages and poor working conditions. And then it is the regular migrant workers who usually take this type of jobs. In case of UK, it was said that it was the Polish woman after the entrance of Poland in the EU who worked in this type of jobs. It is the work of Simonazzi from 2008 comparing this type of welfare regimes. And of course there are some more other types of regimes which are not which can be placed in between. But I can also point out to the rudimentary welfare state regime, in which the state is actually providing very limited services, so the care work is totally unregulated, and the need for the care work and care workers is just satisfied by the employment of irregular migrant women from the labor market. So we can say that in the countries of the developed world, but not only limited with it, also in some countries of the developing world, the middle-income countries in the position of new industrialization efforts and so on. Migrant women are just performing an excellent job by taking over this care work, and the women from middle class and upper class families are in a position to be full members of the labor market by delegating their responsibilities of care work to other women. And in this way, they can avoid the challenging gender-based division of labor, which I call the patriarchal gender-based division of labor. So they don't have confrontation with men for more equal share of the domestic work, but they can delegate it to women. So we can also conclude that domestic workers contribute to the wealth of and well-being of people in these countries, middle and upper class families. Now I can come to the last part of my presentation, and it is about the informal economy in Turkey and the migrants in the informal economy in Turkey. Turkey, a former sending country, especially to Germany in the 60s and 70s, after the stoppage of the recruitment, people tried to come on irregular basis to the European countries in the 80s and 90s, also related with political oppression after the military coup in Turkey. But then it stopped mostly after the 2000s, and Turkey actually became a country of receiving country of immigration from the former Soviet Union countries, the neighboring countries, some Asian and African countries, and especially from the Middle East in recent times. We see that the people coming from former socialist countries actually want to work, be part of the informal labor markets in Turkey, to be able to work and earn some income. The others, which are aiming the West, namely the people from Asian and African countries, usually with the help of smugglers, try to cross over the Aegean. And then we heard lots of dramatic events that they are dying in the seas and or other borders. And when they realize that it is no more possible for them to go further, they stay in Turkey and be also part of the informal economy. And in the last 2 years, Turkey received more than 1.5 million people escaping the war from Syria and Iraq. And they have a temporary protection status in Turkey, and they also join the informal labor markets for their livelihoods because they don't have any other chance. The new situation in Turkey is actually very difficult to analyze because the usual or the traditional conceptual and methodological tools are no more adequate to understand the situation when such a huge number of people now live on the Turkish territory. So it is difficult. In one of his works, Kessel's on theory formation, difficulty of theory formation in migration research, he says that in times of radical transformations in political, economic, and cultural changes, it is not easy anymore to use these traditional tools. So it is also the case now in Turkey for a labor market analysis of these newcomers as refugees. So I'm going to limit myself in the quotes the usual irregular migrants who were in Turkey and who have been in Turkey before the coming of the refugees. I can say that in Turkey the share of informal employment is very high. It is a very prevalent phenomena. It is around 31% in 2009 in a comparative study from ILO, saying that although it is less than some comparable Latin American and Asian countries, it is still very high. So it means an important part of the native population is also part of the informal labor markets. So the newcomers, I mean the irregular migrants, they just join a structure which already exists. And when they incorporate into the labor markets, of course, there is division according to ethnicity and gender in which branches they can work, and of course, it also is decisive on the type of work conditions and exploitation they are confronted with. When we look at in which areas the migrants are working, we see that, first of all, they are in domestic and care services. I would say the majority of the irregular migrants in Turkey are considered or just estimated to or guessed to be. We cannot have an exact number because they are undocumented. Then in entertainment and sex sector, in agriculture, tourism, to some extent in manufacturing, not so widespread as the other branches, and construction as well. And they are in informal sector enterprises, very small-sized enterprises in these sectors. And also we can speak of feminization of migration as a valid expression of the situation, the existing situation in Turkey. Because with the exception of construction, we think that in all of the other branches, the numbers of men and women can be equal, or even women can outweigh men. So the majority are women. We can assume that they are women in Turkey. So we see that they are part of the labor market without work and residence permits. They usually come with tourist visas, or they don't need even to take a visa at the borders. Turkey has a very flexible visa regime compared to the EU countries, and there is always pressure from the EU, Turkey, to strengthen its visa regime and not to allow people to come so easily. And so these people are without visa or visa. They may stay legally in Turkey, but if they exceed the visa periods, then they are in a position of illegal stay in Turkey. But when they work, none of them have work permits, because the law on the work permits for foreigners actually allows people with qualification who are not going to compete with the native workforce, but complete them, which would be complementary to them, to have work permits. The only exception is the domestic services. So in that sense, it is accepted that women can have a work permit and work in care domestic services. Why there is the need for domestic workers? Turkey is a rudimentary welfare state. The state assumes no responsibility with respect to care duties, and it is expected from the family, who, of course, women in the family, to perform this obligation. And especially in middle and upper class income families, the women working in professional jobs with very long hours and perhaps travels often taking place, they need to delegate as well this care responsibility. For older and sick or disabled people or for their children. And they have to procure these services from the market. Actually, the main source of workforce are domestic migrant workers. The women from rural to urban areas, coming from rural to urban areas with low education, low qualification. So it is almost the only possible area of employment for them. But there is no regulation in this area. It is outside labor law, the unionization outside the unionization law, and it is expected that women on both sides arrange among themselves this as an employment or quasi-employment relationship, which takes sometimes the form of a fictive kinship. And the domestic workers are doing either household chores or taking care of children. But in case of an elderly and the sick, which needs also care in the night hours, the women, professional working women, need living care services. The domestic workers cannot provide this type of service because they have their own family responsibilities. There is a very patriarchal way of thinking that women cannot stay in foreigners' house in the night, and the men, their husbands and children waiting for them at home to come and do the household work, and etc. So this gap is actually filled by migrant women from former Soviet Union countries. There are also lots of literature in Turkish tackling this issue. Well, I said that the law on foreigners' work permits give the possibility of working with as regularized workforce. But when we look at the numbers, in 2013, the total numbers of work permits were around 45,000, and 28,000 were for women. I mean, the regular work permits show the feminization of migration. It is 62%. Then half or more than half of them are in domestic and care work. But still, it can be seen as a part of iceberg. The big majority of the women, migrant women, are working as irregular workers without any registration in the families. So it is also preferred by women to be accommodated in the houses of the employers for various reasons of saving and protecting themselves from police controls and so. But of course it has also negative sides of exploitation and mistreatment in some cases. The domestic workers, the native domestic workers, organized very recently in Turkey, and they are demanding that domestic work is recognized as a job, as a proper work. They recognized as workers. Turkey should ratify the ILO Convention 189 on decent work for domestic workers, and they also try to defend the rights of migrant workers. But still, they are in a very, at the beginning, in a very weak position, these type of organizations. On the other hand, we can also say that migrant women are in prostitution sector. Usually they come again from former socialist countries with the knowledge that they are going to work in the prostitution sector. And some of them come for other areas of work, such as domestic work, but then just transferred to prostitution because of low wages or difficulty of finding jobs and different reasons. So they are in much more vulnerable positions compared to domestic workers, because when they are exposed to violence and harassment, they are not in a position to seek justice and to defend themselves. So, as the last slide, I will say something about the migrants in different occupations and the role of ethnicity in these occupations. We see that the employers actually functionalized ethnicity as a factor of preference of different groups of migrants for different types of work. As you can guess, of course, for prostitution, the blonde women of the Ukraine or Russian Federation and some Baltic countries, they are preferred. But in other branches, let's say domestic work, it has been actually the women from Moldova who were preferred, who could speak Turkish. The Turkish mean the minority in Moldova. And now it is the women from Georgia in the first place. Then there are the garment workshops, in which, according to research from Dedeoğlu, Azerbaijan women working as the good Muslim woman speaking Turkish and who acts as untainted, in quotes, women very solemnly and silently. We see that the patriarchal values are used by the employers to let them work without any resistance to the long working hours and conditions. But in the garment shops in Istanbul, where they sell the products to countries of the former Soviet Union and Serbia, the language, Russian language, is necessary for the trade activities. And in that case, although women and men from Azerbaijan or Turkmenistan, they can as well speak Russian, but they are not preferred. The people from Russian Federation and Ukraine and so are preferred. They are considered to be more disciplined, more good working, but the real reason behind, according to a research from Dadelen, is that women who are working as sales personnel can be ready to exhibit some of the fancy dresses as models for the people who are coming to buy these products. So it won't be possible in the case of other migrant women to perform this type of a job, bodily performance. So it is then the women of the Russian Federation or Ukraine. And as the last, I can say that in construction sector, again, the employers say they prefer Turkish-speaking Muslim people, but we all see that these preferences are closely related, actually, with their aim to functionalize the workforce in order to maximize their profits, to have them as working groups without creating any problems. I can say that another research, our research we conducted recently in 2012 in Istanbul, we found out that the wages are not actually lower as as cash payments, but the workers work much more longer hours without annual leave, paid leave, without paid sick leave, and without social security. In that sense, they are lowering the labor costs, and it is the reason why they are preferred. And as conclusion, I can say that informal economy, informal employment is to be observed in all parts of the world. In developed countries, it is mostly the migrant workforce who work in this area. In developing countries, receiving migration, it is the native part of the native workforce and the migrant workforce. And there is a harsh competition sometimes between those two types of groups. And we see a race to bottom, which can create a tension of racist attacks against the migrants. And in the least developed countries, the majority of the people are actually in informal sector employment. What we need is actually a new understanding, an alternative understanding and development in which the labor markets are regulated, decent working conditions are created for the people, and channels are opened for regular migration routes for the people who want to migrate. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Toksöz, for this rich talk. we will continue with our next presentation. In the meantime, while Beatriz Padilla is preparing, there are a few seats still here in the front. You do not need to sit on the floor. In fact, you are not allowed to sit on the floor and block the exit. So please come to the front. There are seats here where you can sit. And I was wondering, is it too dark for you in here? Do we need lights? It's very dark. Is there somebody who can turn on the lights in the back? Okay, so we have some reshuffling. Please, everyone, find your seats now so that we can continue. Thank you. So the second presentation of our afternoon panel is by Beatriz Padilla, as I was telling you, and I won't repeat the title of not running the danger that I have the wrong title, and I would like to give over the word to our second keynote.
Okay, thanks. Should I start? Okay. So, there's some seats over here. Well, I know that Encarna is not here, but I would like to thank Encarna for this invitation and to be able to be here with you and share some of my research and some of my thinking. First of all, let me tell you that yesterday I was impressed with Spivak, but I was sad when I realized that I speak some languages. None of them are, all of them are from the colonizers. So I don't have words to start my presentation with autochthonous language from Latin America, where I'm from. But it doesn't mean that I cannot be thinking differently. So, but I'll do my presentation in my English, my rusty English. I haven't spoken English for many years, so I'll do my best. So let me start by saying that words are not just words. Words, they come from language, and as I said, I'm sorry, I would like to speak other language, but I don't. I speak English, Spanish, and Portuguese, all the colonial languages. But my knowledge comes from the situated knowledge, someone who is from a different continent, who live in the north, who live in the United States, and have been living in Europe since 2002. So this is where my knowledge and my analysis is coming from. The second thing I wanted to say is that I really like the name of the conference because I like to play with these words. And when we said matters or material matters, yeah, material matters, and matters is as a noun and as a verb. And I like that I like that play. But I like that to play this with this also with gender and migration, because I think that gender matters, as we have seen and we have been speaking these days, and also gender is everywhere. So even if we are not recognizing gender, gender is everywhere. And migration matters too, as my colleague also expressed, and I also hope to pass the same message. Let me start also by saying that the current crisis has many consequences. We have been talking a lot about the crisis, but we have been talking about the crisis in a general way. I want to be a little bit more specific. This current crisis has consequences for the North and for the South. And I'll be talking about migration. So if we think of this crisis with consequences in the North and in the South, we are talking about migrations, and we're talking about outgoing migration and incoming migration, both in the North, in the South, from the North to the South, and from the South to the North. So this is, quite unique. In relation to this, I would like to highlight that migrants is a very relevant identity that has been also impacted with the crisis, and it's a relevant identity and a relevant status, and it's a stigmatized one. And this is what leads me to the title of my talk, because I think this, although we recognize there's a feminization of migration, this is not new, we'll be talking about it, but we have also seen a feminization of poverty for quite a long time, and now together with this we're seeing a feminization of suffering. Since I'm coming from Portugal, and I think Portugal would be a very good case study in this sense, because Portugal, in this moment, we are going through a very specific crisis. I mean, the world is, Europe is, but Portugal is a very specific case, going through a very specific crisis. Portugal has very interesting features, I would say. It considers itself as a semi-peripheral country in the EU. What does it mean? Well, it's semi-peripheral, obviously, because of its location. It's located in the south of Europe, and as my colleague pointed out, there are many specific characteristics and features that southern European countries share. Usually not the good ones for the North, or for whatever institutions we talk about. There's also in a semi-peripheral situation, and if we consider the economic development, although Portugal is considered nowadays a developed country, there are many indicators that would indicate something else, so more in between, or this specific situation of semi-peripheral country. And the strategic that Portugal is I guess, betting in, especially in the last year, is building upon the situation of being a semi-peripheral country, which I'm not sure if I like it. I guess I don't like it. Let me explain you why. Because Portugal is, or can be seen as a post-colonial state with a colonial mind. So this is quite something. What I'm trying to say is that the strategy that Portugal is trying to use, or has been trying to use for at least a decade, I would say, is to be or to play this intermediary role. So because it's in the semi-periphery, it's okay if it's aligned with the South, it could be aligned with the North, whatever is better, but it's playing this intermediary role with the colonial mind, saying, I can go to the former colonies, I can go to Brazil, I can go to Angola, I can go to Mozambique, and play this specific role of being in the middle, because we speak the same language, we made them. So now, because of the crisis too, a lot of Portuguese are moving to some of these countries. In addition to migration or emigration of the Portuguese to Europe, which is a very important case, Portuguese are also emigrating to these former colonies. So this is a very specific set of mind. And I wanted to explain it to you so later we can understand better what's the situation in Portugal, especially for migrants. And I see this related to a situation of neocolonialism. So why are the Portuguese going to these countries? They're going there specifically with a neocolonial mind on interests. There are no jobs, so they want to make money, they want to have a life, but obviously to make good salaries in these countries where they were the former colonies. So this is a very specific situation. Also, Portugal it could be called, or I call it, is a post-revolutionary state built on the same foundation than the Estado Novo or the authoritarian state. So what we can say, yes, in 1974 there was a revolution. Did it change much? Well, not much. Elites are exactly the same. The power is exactly in the same hands. So there was no change. So we see that everything stayed the same in the mind of the state and of the elites and of the people that mainly make most of the decision. Also, taking into account Portugal's study case, we can see more related to migration. The Southern European, the Portugal is inserted, it can be classified in the Southern European migration model, as proposed by King and Sontini, because we share this characteristic. As my colleague also pointed out, there's some heterogeneity on the source countries of where the immigrants are coming from. So it's very diverse. It was just it has changed lately. So this is one important characteristic. There's a huge informality and concentration of the immigrant in the third sector and in services, as she pointed out. Also, this labor market, or where they concentrated, is very much segregated. Very segregated in terms of ethnic, racial, and gender status. So there are very specific niches for that. Also, there's an important feminization of migration that was not true before. And is a lot of the immigrants are in a irregular situation, what I call the irregularity vicious cycle, which I'll talk later. So we see that people keep, being from regular to regular, as my colleague pointed out. In terms of a welfare regime, Spin Anderson, when he thought about the models in the first time, forgot about the Mediterranean and the South, but later on it was solved. So he talked about the Mediterranean welfare regime, and that's where Portugal fits again with the rest of Southern Europe. So what is the welfare regime is very important because it tells you where's the piggy bank or what kind of safety net we want to have or the state decides to have, and also because it's what some people call the Robin Hood of the to repair or to make up for some welfare for disparities. So what instruments the state designs to help in these cases? So and as my colleague also pointed out, in southern European countries, as in Portugal, this safety net or these programs are weaker than in the north. So it's not the same. To have a strong or well-structured welfare regime, we need strong state, which we don't necessarily have in Portugal. So what happened in Portugal if we consider migration? We had to understand that the migrants come from different countries, but also where they're coming from different welfare regimes, where the welfare regimes sometimes, in many cases, are very weak. So they don't know or they're not used to having a lot of social programs to compensate for these disparities. So in this case, many times migrants do not know the rights, or don't know, or it's harder for them to know, or they need some time to know the rights. And also, it's a matter of the matter of entitlement and enactment of rights is not so straightforward. We know there are some rights. Can we exercise this right? Do we really have access to this right? And this is not always the case for Portugal, as we'll see. Let me talk a little bit about the crisis. The crisis, we know that it started in 2008-9, but for example, in Portugal, arrived later, in 2011. That's when we had to welcome, this is fake, the Troika. So the IMF, the Central European Bank, and the European Union came for help, to help Portugal, of course. What kind of help was that? Was it a help based on austerity, tax increases, and less welfare? So they came to tell. And let me point out that I'm using this picture because these pictures are graffiti from Lisbon, from an anthropologist, a visual anthropologist, that just was kind of publishing an article where this picture were taken, but got censorship by the same academia in social sciences. So I was able to get these pictures and show you. So this picture kind of show you what's the spirit, what is the situation, how people are feeling in Portugal about the crisis and the Troika and the cuts and the austerity. The first one says, Merkel's get out of here. And the puppets are the prime minister and the person from the coalition, and then no more cuts, no more troikas, and corrupt government. So what does it mean, or what did it mean, or it has meant these last years to have the troika based in Lisbon? Well, interesting is to recognize something that was said this morning, I think, is that the measures that have been used and applied and brought again to an European country, they're not new. They are the same failed recipes from Latin America, from Eastern Europe, from other places in the world, but we keep doing the same mistakes. So these recipes, or these measures, have been the stabilization of public accounts of the public sector, which means austerity overall. I guess that's the key word, austerity. Wage and pension cuts, and we're talking about wage and pension cuts even in the lower salaries. The lower salary, so you have an idea, what's the minimum wage in Portugal? I don't know what's the minimum wage in Germany, but in Portugal it's 485 euros. It was raised to 505 last month, but this is the minimum wage. And a lot of people don't even make minimum wage. And it was just in the news this week also that almost, so you have an idea of what I'm talking about, almost 70% of unemployed do not receive unemployment benefits. So we're talking about a very specific situation with very specific vulnerabilities. And these are thinking of the people that do have access to unemployment. Also, there has been a reduction of social support programs, a lot. And migrants, in general, tend to have less access to this social support. And even it's worse for the case of women who we know work in the service sector or in sectors very much related to the informality, as my colleague pointed out. In addition, new laws, labor laws have been passed. Most of them are for the flexibilization. So the idea is to end contracts with rights. So we can have contracts, okay, but we are not creating more rights. So that's over. We know, also the state is outsourcing public services and services in general more and more. So what does it mean? We had to follow this liberal state model, including, what I'll be talking about later, the natural health service. all these measures, or all these cuts and austerities, are recipes that are gender blind. So we need to understand that too, because they're supposed to be for all, but we know that the laws are never for all, and in the same way. So these are gender blind and insensible to diversity. So they're not taking care in a different way of women. They're not looking for migrants, or they're not looking for maybe the most vulnerable people. It's for everyone. And this has had also an impact on people's mentality. Although in the beginning of the crisis, some people were much forward and went out in the street, this has almost disappeared. And the sentiment in Portugal right now is there's no way out. So it's a very sad sentiment, and I think that it's very different from what we can see in Spain and Greece. People are not going out to the street. Just let me show you this picture. There was a protest against cuts in the national health system a couple of years ago, when people were still going out to the street. And it was because this building is a maternity hospital, and people mobilized to avoid its closing. And since then, it hasn't closed yet, but every month there's a threat that it's going to close down. But it hasn't yet. This is sometimes very common in Portugal too. So if we analyze the crisis in Portugal, we can see that there are intended consequences. We know, the economists always know that there are intended consequences of the crisis and the measure that comes out of the crisis. So the cuts, the state downsizing, even though it was subestimated, the firing of public servants or people working in the public sectors, the tax increase, those was intended. The intention was a specific tax. It was to make an efficient state. But in the States, we know that we still have an inefficient state. It doesn't matter. But what maybe, I guess, people in the Troika and in the government were not thinking were about the unintended consequences that we also should know or should have learned from other experience before. The worst of the situation, or the worst of the unintended, for them, consequences was the stagnation of the economy. There are no jobs. There's no job creation, although there's always an announcement about job creation, but that's not true. There's more unemployment. The real effects on informal economy with really impact on consumption. So material matters. This has been, this has affected mainly, although a lot of Portuguese, but a lot of migrants. Because most of them work, as we've seen several times, in the domestic service, in the case of women, in the construction sector, for the case of men. Construction is stopped also some years ago. So there's no way out, even within the family. If women used to work in the service sector or as domestic or in the domestic sector, and men used to work in the construction disappeared, and in many cases, women either lost their jobs or got less jobs, because sometimes they work different hours in different houses, and because of the crisis, the middle class cannot pay that much. So they also got some reductions or some cuts in their salary. Most of the times, they're also not declared in Social Security, so they don't have access to unemployment. They don't have sometimes a good safety net, especially if there's something that needs to come from welfare. And there's more discrimination and exclusion due to the crisis. Because I would say that in the early 2000s, a lot of people were not against, so there was not a very clear opinion against immigrants, as there were in other countries. But with the crisis, the situation is also changing. I'm not saying they're lynching in the street, but the sentiment has changed. So now there's this more generalized feeling that migrants shouldn't have rights. And this is growing in people's minds. And sometimes immigrants even tend to think that, or if they are regular and others are irregular, those that are regular think that they should have more rights than those that are irregular. Although the situation of being regular and irregular is a trick. And so this feeling and this policy of the migrant should go home. So what is the government doing? What is the state doing? We're trying to think programs so we can send people back home. And they are convinced that they're doing something good. So we have to think. There are many serious things. So now let me move to Portugal and post-colonialism. Portugal, or the Portuguese, have a very subtle way to doing things. And this has to be understood. Sometimes I know they might be difficult to understand. And this is based on the old time, on the old mind of the Portuguese colonialism, which was named, it had a specific name, Lusotropicalism. It was a myth that the Portuguese would mix with people, with the people that they conquered, in Africa and in Brazil. This is the idea they still uphold. This mixing, obviously, took place, but it was due to raping women, the indigenous people, and raping also the African slave. So there was mixing. They don't want to recognize the other part of the mixing. But they still believe that they mix. And they always have the comparison. We were better than the English, we were better than the Dutch, and we were better than the Spanish. They were better. They are sure, they are convinced. So they still think this is the view of the colonial way of seeing the world. So this imaginary can help us to understand how they see migrants today. So they see today they see themselves, or Portugal sees themselves, as a welcoming country. So they keep talking, we welcome people, we welcome people. We should ask migrants if they feel so welcome. We're not racist. We're not racist. We mix. We went to Brazil, we mix. We went to Africa, we mix. We're not racist. But, most of the studies show that this subtle racism sometimes could be even worse than flagrant racism. Because when there's something so obvious, you can react. When it's hidden, you cannot really react. If you react, you're crazy, because they're not racist. They just tell you, if you are not black, like me, they tell me, that's something because they're black. They're some pretos. They're black. But they don't say it in front of people. But they're not racist. They believe they're not racist. Same thing about sexism. They are not sexist. Of course not. And they're convinced. So all this subtle sexism, subtle machism is very, very strong. But they don't like to recognize that. Not even many times women. Because they have numbers that show you that other way. So they say, well, no, if you look at the numbers, there are more women that are educated than men. It's true. But it doesn't mean much. Because then if you look, who is on the top of all the positions are men. So that women study more, for example, than men doesn't mean anything. If you look at the wage gap, it's a 70%. So there is obviously a wage gap, but they have a trouble recognizing that. And obviously they are not recognized that they're sexist and sexist at the same time. Although the relation with migrants is very condescending and patronizing, they still see themselves as the good master and the slaves. Obviously they don't say in this way, but the kind of relation is based on this. So they enforce this illusion of equality, where migrants or minorities cannot complain, and so they see this what I call unequal equality, because there's no such equality, but they are convinced that everyone has the right to everything. And this, in my reading, hinders the enactment of citizenship. Citizenship in the broad sense, not just a passport or an ID. We have rights. We have rights. So in general, if you are not recognized, this and you cannot complain, this hinders the enactment of your citizenship, or of you as a citizen, of your rights. And rights for them are not seen as such, as right, but they are seen as an act of generosity. We're so nice that we give people rights. So this has an impact in how people can enact or claim their rights. And my understanding and my reading that this is very disempowering, especially for migrant women, because they're always doing us a favor. They're always doing migrant favors. And one last point in relation to this mentality of the Portuguese is the way, and I think this comes a lot from the authoritarian regime, is the exercise of micropowers and the discretionary power. A lot of people, especially administrative staff, in any service, public service desk, has a lot of power, this small power, that can say, yes, you have the right, I can set an appointment for you, or you don't have the right. Even if they have the right and they are told that they don't have the right, where can they complain? So this exercise of micropowers is very powerful, because it's exercised by the administrative and by the security guards that are everywhere in all public services desk. Let me give you an example. Up to 2006, when was the change of the nationality law, the administration could reject the request for nationality just because it was called discretionary power. So the person that reject this request didn't have to explain. Then it was good in 2006. It was changed, and it means a lot, because if we see how many people after this have been able to get citizenship, we see that the discretionary power of these people were enormous. So it's sometimes things that we don't pay attention to, but it's very, very important, and it's very important for letting people access a right or a service or not. So, from my point of view, I think that the colonial perspective helps to question and to reflect about this issue. Because the situation and the condition of immigrants in the metropolis, which is the case, can be illuminating. Because we can apply the colonial perspective, the colonial theory, in what I don't like, but the metropolis. Most of the immigrants, although it has been changing, but most of the immigrants come from the former Portuguese colonies. So this makes sense, how you deconstruct the colonial in the metropolis. And you can also apply this view in relation to migration to other migrants as well, because the relation of superiority, inferiority is the same. You can also discover the gender regimes and or the gender regimes of oppression in the metropolis using the colonial theory, because it's the same, as we'll see later. How intersectionality works, how gender intersects with being a migrant, with the race, with ethnicity, with origin, with age, we could say many things. Also because of the domination and subordination relations. And here I'm very critical, because I think we're in a kind of a ambivalent situation, not to call it schizophrenic, when we have, I think, a crazy European Union, but also obviously a crazy Portugal, where I'm talking from. We have this discourse in the European Union that we need migrants, because we need the labor force. And there's always a different discourse. When we sometimes need arms, labor force, you're playing labor force. Sometimes we need skills. We just created the blue card. I mean, this is pretty new. So we need skills. But then we don't want the migrants. It's true. So it's not normal. And then we also have heard this so many times. Europe is aging. How many times have you heard that? Oh, we're all getting old. Now one is having babies. In Portugal, now one is having babies. So we want babies. But then we don't want really migrants to have babies because we don't know we want their babies. You see? Because their babies later are going to be Europeans. So I think we are in this ambivalent or schizophrenic situation in this relation of domination and subordination. Even more, I would say that the rights are very limited and uncontained. I think the European Union and Portugal likes to claim the defense of human rights, but those human rights are to be enforced somewhere else, in those developing countries, because they don't have human rights. We show them, but we don't have to apply human rights in Europe. So if someone is dying, but it's undocumented, it's his or her problem, because that's not a human right here. Human rights are in another continent. And I think this is very much present in most of the policies in the European Union, in most of the countries. In some countries, some time ago, had a different mindset. This is changing, and it's getting even worse. So, who can work? How long can they work? How many years they can come? For how long do we need them? But now, can we send them back? This is the logic, which for me is not logic, but I guess that more people convinced that it's very logic. Who can have babies? We need babies. We need children. Because we don't have labor force for the future. I mean, I'm not a demographer, but this calculation has been done so many times. But who can have baby? Who can have a baby? And what kind of baby do we want? Because then we see sometimes we don't really want immigrants to have too many babies. They shouldn't have babies. They should have learned. So we're applying other kind of regimes, gender regimes, reproduction regimes, sexuality regimes to women. And then, who can access to safe pregnancies and deliveries? Well, we're in the European Union. Everyone should have access. But is it really true? I know that in Portugal it's not true. I'm not going to talk about other countries, although I also know. And then, if they don't have safe pregnancies and delivery, who gets blamed? It's their fault. It's their fault. They didn't seek help. They didn't seek the doctor. When it's not true. Maybe they could not see the doctor. They were discouraged to see the doctor. Or they didn't even know that they could see a doctor. But they are blamed. So every time I hear these unsafe pregnancies or bad deliveries, blaming immigrant women, I wonder. So moving more to women, migrant women and families, let me tell you something that Portugal is also believed. Portugal has been known for being best at migrant-friendly policies. If you're familiar with MIPEX, with the Migration Policy Index, you know that Portugal comes second in the world. So it's very good. It comes first in the United Nations report. First. Good. In the reports. Then, if we go to see, I know why sometimes it looks so good and it is not really that good, because most of the time these index are made based on policies, on laws, or what the rights are. But in many cases, as is the case in Portugal, law is not always applied, it's not always obeyed, it's not always used. So it doesn't matter. If I'm going to measure the law and I'm not going to measure if it's applied, I have a big gap here. So Portugal, what it likes to do is to look good in the picture. And maybe until some years ago it could look okay. But more recently, and especially since the crisis, all the investment in integration policies is disappearing. Policies are really disappearing. And I would like to give one example about undocumented migrants. As I said, undocumented migrants is a vicious cycle, as my colleague also pointed out. But in the case of Portugal, being undocumented migrants can include a diversity of situation. They can be undocumented migrants. In Portugal, they don't come on boats. So it's not the same situation than in the Mediterranean. So they can be undocumented due to the informality of the economy. People work without contracts. National Portuguese people also work without contracts, but they're Portuguese, they don't need to leave the country. This situation is worse for women. Also because women and immigrant women are never seen as the breadwinners. They're always seen as dependent. So also keep this in mind. Moreover, undocumented migrants sometimes can be children and youth who inherit this status from the parents. Some youth, some children have been born in Portugal and undocumented. How can you explain that? So they inherit this situation. And this, is very serious when they become adults, because they are not just irregular migrants, but they also irregular migrants who are not children and not vulnerable, so that now they can be criminals. Also, there's a big change on of the perception of being undocumented. So any migrant is seen as undocumented, and this perception is passed throughout the society. And this has specific consequences in health, as is called a precious global good. I would like to be a really precious global good, but it's not always. And in this case, we always blame the victim. So in the case of migrant women and the families during the crisis, what has happened? There were in place many good practices, I would say good practices in the field of migration and health. Good practices, although are patchwork, come when the welfare state does not provide. But in any case, there were available many good practices, and with the crisis, they are tending to finish, or they are walking towards an end. For example, there is an end of the exemption fee for undocumented migrants. Up to recently, undocumented migrants were able to go to the doctors and have an economic exemption and seek consultation. Now they cannot. There are less mobile units. That is usually what does the outreach services to especially women and children, go to the more hard-to-reach neighborhoods. There are also some end of the good practices that were coming from NGOs and civil society, because there are less funding. But in a crisis, there's less funding. So this is also a vicious circle. There's some deterioration of policies and practice within the national health system. So the entitlement and the enactment of rights are at stake. Who can access to services? What's the accessibility? Because we can access, but what kind of accessibility? Is it cultural or languages appropriate? Who pays for that? And what about quality? And in most cases, quality doesn't even count for migrants. Because everyone's supposed to have the same right, but it's not always the case. In terms of legislation, Portugal moved from a universal and free care system to one that you're supposed to pay. So this has been changing. Even the Constitution says that should be universal. There are also a lot of changes in the organizational and financial structure of the national health system. These organizational changes are targeting specific publics. And who are this public? Most of them are the most vulnerable population, and in these cases, women and children. But these organizational changes exclude certain population, most of them migrants. They provide less proximity care, which is always needed for migrants and most vulnerable population. There's less community health. There are more indicators, because this new philosophy within the public sector, that what's important is to meet the indicators. The indicator is to have many consultations. Doesn't matter if it's better if there are 2 or 3 minutes. They can never be more than 10. So if you are the doctor or a nurse and you had to see a migrant and you probably have some communication problem, you might need more time. But that's not taken into account. You had to, make these indicators. So this is very problematic. The fees have doubled, more than doubled since the Troika came to Portugal. There's a lot of services reduction or outsourcing. So in these niches where the outsourcing take place, migrants are excluded. If they want to get a sonogram, even for migrant women, who even undocumented women should get all treatment, that's what the law says. If this outsource, they had to pay, so they cannot pay. So this is how it's working. Undocumented migrant can be seen, but they had to pay in full. Obviously, they don't have the money. And the fees, sometimes there's some fees exemption, but they're not enough to solve the problem that we are seeing in Portugal. In this sense, I see there's a short circuit between the policies within the European Union and within most of the member states. Between integration policies and health policy, there's no dialogue, there's no relation. We can see it very easily. While all integration policies are in home affairs, health policies with no dialogue to integration are in health and consumption or DG Sanco. So there's no connection. In a recent project or research that we carry, trying to assess migrants' needs assessment in relation to health, we compare migrant women and autochthonous women, and I'll just read you some of the issues. Are there differences? Say, legal migrants are less likely to have, and I'm talking about, in this case, legal migrants. So legal migrants are less likely to have family doctors, more likely to wait longer for consultation, more likely to face longer waiting lists and not getting appointments. Also, legal migrants face more problems to pay co-payments than national and are more likely to get less continuity in their relationship with their doctors. Migrants are less, as well as national women, face a complicated scheduling system for consultations, but migrants do not always know how to navigate the system. It's always changing. One example, while only 4.3% of nationals mention not having a family doctor, 35.2% of the migrants say so. So it's a clear difference. So if this is true for legal migrants, what would be the case for undocumented migrant women? So even worse. Not to show you, don't have to read it, it's just the data I just told you. Let me move quickly to some ethnographic cases that I want you to bring. So we see how it works. We know that migrants have complicated lives. So just brought you two cases. Edna, she's 32. She's Cape Verdean, but born in San Tomé, which shows you exactly the Portuguese colonialism. Has been in Portugal 20 years. She came when she was young. She was unprotected victim of domestic violence. She has actually 2 children living with her mother. She's unemployed with no benefit. She used to work in the cleaning sector. She remade her life with a new partner, who at that time was unemployed, and she's pregnant and has a young boy, 2 years old. She cannot afford food many times. She doesn't have food to eat, and she's pregnant. She doesn't have food for her son. She cannot take her son to childcare. She became pregnant waiting to get contraception. Isn't that crazy? She was waiting and waiting to get the contraception while she became pregnant. She finally got the appointment when she already was pregnant. The NGOs, some of them, refused to help her because she was labeled as a recurrent user. Because she had this 2-year-old boy, she was using the same service, so she was labeled recurrent user, we cannot help you. Her housing condition is dangerous for her health, so she goes to the street and walks around, so she's not in an environment that is very prejudicial for her health. She suffered from several health problems, oral health, overweight, high blood pressure, undiagnosed infection while she was pregnant because the doctor doesn't do the test, etc., etc. she's always looking for solution. So she's not sitting around. Her daughter was finally born underweight, but safe. And this is one of the typical cases. And let me tell you that we found many cases of pregnant women becoming pregnant while waiting for the contraception. So who should be blamed for that? Well, I'll just skip through Bruna, but it was the same. I mean, she got an abortion, but she didn't get the support to have an abortion. She got an infection after the abortion, but before leaving the hospital, she was forced to get an implant. The implant changed her body system, many problems. She was not informed of the consequences of having the implant as a birth control. In the end, she wants to take it out, but she's not allowed to, and the implant expired, but the doctor wouldn't take it out because they didn't know how. So this is a common situation, a recurrent situation. So just the final thoughts. With the crisis, obviously, we see a worsening overall situation related to the crisis, as I said, and to authority. In the national health system, many migrant women face discrimination, segregation, and prejudice. As migrant, as women of color, as poor. There are many stereotypes. There are different stereotypes. I won't go over this, but there are different stereotypes for Brazilian women, for Cape Verdeans or African women, and this has an impact on the kind of services they get. In the national health system, health professionals make decisions to control their reproduction and their sexuality. What kind of contraception they can get. Implants are for African women. Should they have babies? Quality care is not an issue for them. Poor health, poverty, and suffering is embodied by migrant women who are not seen as citizens. Information and knowledge is power. In this case, the lack of this information and knowledge is disempowerment. The strategies that women find to solve the problems are good, but they're not enough. So I think that in order to think more, a decolonial feminist approach would allow us to question the former colonial relation in current host-migrant relation, examine the connection between gender disadvantage and health, identify the uneven distribution of power within the public health policy, the publics in general, and in terms of gender. It helps to value the experience as a category of analysis that women, to know what women really appreciate and need. And just a final thought, decolonizing gender, migration, and health with the women that participated in the study.